Well, hello everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Certified Forgotten. We are your favorite horror podcast that talks about films with 10 or fewer reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. I feel like we've done a better job of introducing our tagline or operative theory, how we got our name in these episodes. So, as a reminder, if this is your first time listening, we believe that some films are certified fresh, some films are certified rotten, our films are certified forgotten. That does, Matthew Donato, my partner and business partner and friend who helps me run this podcast, that does make it sound like maybe we're a little bit more kitschy than we are, but I still like the line. I still love it.
Well, we are entirely kitschy as well. We're talking about movies once again that people have quote unquote forgotten. But I like the idea though. We're finding more and more guests bringing us movies that are resonating with the niche audience as well. Like it's nice to
Mm.
post a far out there movie like The Pit last week or the week before and get responses like, "Oh my god, you're not ready for The Pit," just from random followers. So I like where we are in our niche. I'm fine with it. We know we're all organic. We have no SEO value, but at the same time, I don't know. This is what I want to be doing. Everyone else and their mother has a Scream podcast. I don't. That's not us. We don't need to be that.
Yeah, I do agree with you. I love it. And it's funny though. I do feel like our films fall into one of two categories, which is our audience is like, oh, I've never even heard of that. Or all the people who I constantly disagree with are like, great fucking movie, man. So it's definitely it's a litmus test for my online friendships in terms of the movies that we talk about on the show.
Well, I'm not going to waste any more
Don't
time
do it.
then.
Don't
I'm,
waste
I,
my time
I'm
or
not going to
your
waste your
time.
time, anyone's time, even though that's what we're doing right now by bantering. But no, let's get to it then. The meat of the episode. This is a guest episode. It ain't just me and Monagle this time. And talking about movies that are maybe forgotten in the realm of both critics and audiences. I can say I'd never even heard of the movie that we're going to be talking about today that our guest brought us. So I'm not going to waste any more time jabbering on. And I'm going to bring in Jarrod Hornbeck, who is one half of the hosting duo of Puppet Masters and Castle Freaks, a weekly podcast devoted entirely to the filmography of low budget mogul Mr. Charles Band. So, Jarrod, welcome.
Oh, thank you. This is a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So Jared, I normally we have sort of a flow for these episodes.
Hmm.
We start with, your earliest horror memories, but I want to get the big question, the $1 million question out of the way, out of the gate.
Sure.
Why Charles Band?
Okay, so my co-host Steve and I have told this story a few times of how the show started because that is a common question that
Hmm.
we're asked often when we say what it is we do, for this little hobby of ours. We were working on something else. Steve and I were podcasting together. We were actually doing this was back in 2021, maybe. We were doing a Sopranos recap show.
Mm.
Because I mean, The Sopranos is still, for my money, still the greatest television show of all time, and it's so dense, and there's so much to talk about. Uh, and it was a really low stakes operation. It was us and two other people, and just I think we were putting episodes out, and they were maybe being listened to by our immediate family and some friends as homework, but nobody really was, downloading it that much. It was a small thing, but Steve and I had a really good rapport. He had come on as a guest initially, and then the other co-host was like, I like him, let's see if he wants to join full time. And we ended up talking off mic a lot of times about horror movies. And then one of the things that happened was he mentioned, this is, I'm going to say, around 2022, he mentioned that he had read the David J. Thurston Dewey book, It Came from the Video Aisle, which is the like comprehensive history of full moon features. And I also read that book. And so he said that, and I was like, oh, cool, you're the other one. Like, I was like, I didn't think anybody read that book.
Yeah.
So we started talking about how crazy we thought Full Moon was. And then it was just, we would reference obscure horror movies or an obscure full moon movie here and there. And then later that year, Charles Band released his autobiography, which is called Confessions of a Puppet Master, which is fantastic. And I recommend anyone read it, even if you've never even heard of or seen a Charles Band movie before. It is a breezy, hilarious read about what it's like to be a low budget kind of guerrilla style filmmaker and producer. And so when that was coming out, we were talking about how crazy his life was and how many movies he made. And then we were just thinking, like, wow, there's hundreds of them. And then I had the thought where I was like, someone has to have done a podcast where they watch all of them. Like someone has to have done that. So I looked into it and I found someone with this that mission statement of a show who had recorded and released 3 podcast episodes and then stopped. And so I was like, no, actually, this is not an
Yep.
untapped market. This is actually something that doesn't really exist. And then we started taking it pretty seriously. Like we were like, all right, we've seen a number of them. There's a lot of them we haven't seen. We have to decide, are we going to make this like a bad movie podcast? Are we just going to make fun of them the whole time? Or do we want to actually, like, since we know a bit about the history of the company and the production, do we want to kind of like give these movies the treatment that mainstream movies are getting in other podcasts? And that was the direction we chose to go. And I think it was the right one.
Yeah, I have one. I would say I've guested on a similar podcast like that before, which is Eric Roberts is the Man, which is run by my friend Doug Tilley, and that is very much that his podcast is dedicated to the entire filmography of Eric Roberts, which is every movie ever made minus like 7.
Hmm.
And part of the thing about that the reason that I love that podcast, and the reason that I think you guys chose absolutely correctly, is they love Eric Roberts. Like they love his movies when they're good, they love his movies when they're bad. And I have such an affection for those shows that do those deep dives into one thing. That's that expression, an inch wide and a mile deep. I do think, like, I don't think there's a version of that that would be sort of sardonic and making fun. It comes from a place of love, and I don't think that you guys would have the reputation you do if you were kind of like teeing it up to make a couple of jokes about budget and quality and things that are just the status quo for a lot of filmmakers.
Well, in fairness, we do joke about stuff like that sometimes. Like
Of
we
course.
found the perfect balance of how to kind of poke fun at the things that are dated or were maybe anything that's cynical. Like we're kind of okay with poking fun at too if we feel like the reason, if it was a cash grab, if it wasn't made for the best reasons, we don't mind drawing negative attention to that. But I do think when we first started the show, we were a little bit more critical, and people were happy when they first found it. But some of our earliest feedback was like, for in so many words, be nicer.
Hmm.
And so we were. And so we're incredibly charitable. Now we're like looking for nuggets of greatness in movies that most mainstream podcasts wouldn't even touch.
Yeah.
And I think that brings a kinship, I think, with what we're doing here in a way. And I hear you're
Hmm.
echoing a lot of the statements that me and Monagle try to stay on. And when we started the podcast, I think it was like our first few episodes, we started with like Sauna, Demon Wind, but we were picking movies, and we were picking movies that just fit the mold, whether they were good or not. Like we didn't have the rule of a guest has to bring us something they love. It was, oh, we're just going to go through any horror movie that has at the time 5 or less critic reviews on Rotten
Mm.
Tomatoes. And very early on, we hit this movie called Bad Moon, and it was like a western werewolf.
Sorry, it's High Moon.
Oh, sorry,
Just get
High
the title right.
Moon.
High Moon. Yep.
Right, sorry, Bad Moon, good movie.
I was going to say, I find it really hard to believe there's only 5 like Rotten Tomatoes ratings for Bad Moon, like one of Steve Johnson's like best like
Right,
werewolf designs.
right. Thank you, Monagle, for the correction. But I mean, we did that episode, and we found ourselves very quickly. It wasn't as fun just being another podcast that's like, oh man, we watched this shitty movie, so you wouldn't have to. And like, I feel like that is so many of them out there. I feel like it's so many of we're gonna power through all the worst, blah blah blah, and then right there we diverted. Like we diverted. And we're like, what if we just talk about movies that other people love? So no matter what, there's someone here championing something, and like those conversations, they're more fulfilling, they're more fun, and you're right. The deep dive like nature of it. When I would pitch certain kind of listicles, when I was still writing those for a bit of time, I would be like, oh, like surely someone has reviewed every single Amityville spinoff, fake Amityville, anything that says Amityville movie. And sure enough, at the time, before like Joe Lipsett was doing it at Bloody, it was exactly that. It was like, oh yeah, like everyone gives up after 2 or 3. Like no one has the follow through that.
Nobody has the stamina to make it to Amityville Death Toilet or Amityville Karen.
Right. But like they also deserve. I'm a big believer that indie horror, indie cinema deserves to be, talked about in the
Of
same
course.
way that we do bigger movies, quote unquote, however you want to say. And that has always been kind of, when I was reviewing it, I do review indie horror, and I treat it just like a movie. And I feel like some people don't. So it's nice to have those podcasts that are going for the little guys, but still giving it the academic thought, like the full critique, all that stuff. Like it's important.
I've gotten really cynical in the sense that there are way too many B movie podcasts. There's way too many B attempts at B movie horror comedy podcasts. There are so many of them out there, and you have to be somewhat knowledgeable about the subject matter, and you also need to be funny. And I've listened to some out of pure curiosity that are awful. I'm not going to name any names. I do want to shout out, like, obviously, I'm assuming there's probably some overlap of people who listen to your show and people who have heard like We Hate Movies. Like We Hate Movies was a really the I started just like that as a bad movie podcast,
Mhm.
but it really was more like they were just having fun with it. And they were improv guys, so they would have bits and stuff like that, and they did it very well. And then there is another podcast that I want to shout out called Queens of NC-17, which is a horror movie comedy podcast with these two women who are based out of Pittsburgh, and they don't do they do have recurring bits, but it's just I find the two of them so endearing and so funny. And it's kind of the same thing. Like they'll come on and be like, "Oh, our thing is we're a bad movie podcast," but they'll preface the one being like, "We love this movie." Like it's not really that they're trying to say something's bad. It's just how you market it. And there's so many of them where the comedy doesn't work. They come in really unprofessional and unprepared.
Mhm.
The sound quality is bad. There's like 15-second pregnant pauses when jokes don't land and stuff like that. And it's like, I feel like you know how to edit or
Well, I
that
mean,
you
shout out
should.
Michael Verratti and Peaches Christ, Midnight Mass. Again, like you
Oh, the
know the
best.
people who know their shit. You know the people who are entertaining. Like you know the ones you should listen to. And there might be so many options nowadays because podcasts are just everybody's got a podcast. It's the running joke, but I don't know. I have latched on to the good ones, and the people who are always going to take it serious, but also bring that love and passion. And I think at the end of the day, it isn't fun anymore to be that old school kind of blogosphere
Yeah.
attitude where haha, like I'm better than the movies, yada yada yada. Like no, I kind of I'm over that. We're all over that. I think we're collectively as a movie loving culture done with that bullshit, and I think we're better for it. And those of us that actually evolved with the times and realized, oh no, we
Hmm.
are better for just being sincere and loving the movies. And again, critique is there, but it's coming from a place of
Yeah.
passion. That's where the good stuff is.
Yeah, and I know I think we can point out like the ain't it cool news approach to film criticism, which I feel like I can say because half a lot of the writers that I follow on Blue Sky are former ain't it cool news writers who have, for a variety of reasons, but we'll also say, for uh, the quality of the writing, have very much broken with the kind of stylistic stuff that got them into the industry 10, 15, 20 years
Mm.
ago. So I do think there's a season for everything. I was hugely into Mystery Science Theater 3000 when I was a kid and in my teens.
Yeah.
And
Same.
I have a slightly more complicated relationship with it now, just because I kind of like the movies to stand on their own merits and not necessarily, get that treatment, even though I know it does come from a loving place. So yeah, it's. I mean, it all comes down to earnestness, right? Like earnestness and is in short order on the internet, and it's nice to find people that approach stuff with it.
Oh, thank you.
So let's back it up then. Jared, we're going to talk a little bit
Sure.
about your early days with the horror genre. So, obviously, now well known to a lot of podcast listeners and horror fans as sort of like a B movie horror guy. Was that always the type of horror that you gravitated towards, or did you come by it through another door, through another part of the genre?
So I feel like that's a great question, by the way. I feel like people who often describe themselves as 80s kids a lot of times are born in the 70s and grow up in the 80s. I was not. I was born in the first year of the decade, but I consider myself very much an 80s kid because I had a very interesting relationship with media as a kid. I wasn't a sheltered kid. I wasn't a kid whose parents had a really strong control on the things that I watched. It was like I consumed all kinds of stuff when I was young, and so I have very vivid memories about movies, music, television, books, anything like that from the time. I was just taking as much of it in. I don't really want to go off on a tangent about what media was like in my household because I did grow up in a slightly different situation from some people. I guess I'll indulge in for like 2 minutes in this.
Please, yeah, you're the guest. This is where you're not hosting; you're the guest, which means you get to indulge the stories as much as you want.
Um, no, so when I was a kid, both of my parents worked at the Guggenheim Cafe and the Guggenheim Museum in Manhattan. And so I'm a New Yorker, native New Yorker. It took me a really long time to lose the accent. People always ask where my accent is, and I'm like, it took me a really long time of like I like my fair ladying, Pygmalioning myself to try to lose that accent. But when they worked there, they worked around a lot of creatives. My mom's cousin, who was a big, uh, you know, uh, very bohemian, artistic guy, and then the people they worked with were all, struggling actors or artists or people trying to make money, but they were all creative types. There was a point where the pastry chef in the Guggenheim Cafe where my parents were working was Klaus Nomi, which I find to be wild. And so those were the people I grew up around. I grew up around a lot of same sex couples. I grew up around the LGBTQ as a kid, and a lot of creative people, artists, filmmakers, things like that. My father worked in the record industry. So when he then got a job working, I forget the order for a Record World or Record Hunter first, but he was the kind of guy who he would get a lot of perks from that. So I can remember being like 3 or 4 years old. And my aunt is babysitting me because my parents had tickets to the very first VMAs and the after parties and stuff like that because my dad was an industry guy. And so music and he was also a cinephile, and so like music and movies and books and all of that stuff was very much encouraged. Like my parents listened to current music at the time. They weren't stuck in their like classic rock of the 60s, even though they weren't kids. They were, my parents were in their 30s and they were going out with their friends to clubs dancing to Depeche Mode and New Order and stuff like that. Like, they were just cool. Like when I was a kid. And so I always felt like I was encouraged to expand my horizons and stuff. And so, really, my first experience with horror was Large Marge in Pee Wee's Big Adventure, and that scared the shit out of me. And I remember thinking, like, this is supposed to be funny. It's a claymation thing, you know. A couple of years later, I was living in Queens, and there was a mom and pop video store right around the corner from my apartment. And I went in there, and it was right when they were releasing Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors on VHS. And I saw the cardboard cutout of Freddy, like the life size standee with the movies. And I was looking at the box art and looking at the back, and I was like, I don't know exactly what this is, but I need this in my life immediately. And so I made a deal with my parents to let me rent it. And they were like, I think they were kind of like, all right, well, sure. If you're scared of it, you're not going to be allowed to rent it again, but we'll give it a try. I became full blown obsessed to the point where then 6 months later, or however long it was, part four was coming out in the theater. And I begged and begged and begged till finally my mom let my 16-year-old cousin, who I think only had his learner's permit, take me unsupervised. Well, I was supervised by him, but not someone 17 or over, to the theater to see part four. So my real first break in horror was franchise stuff. It was Freddy. And so I was obsessed with Freddy. And then shortly after Freddy, this is, I think, kind of funny. Growing up in New York, my introduction really to Jason was the TV spot for Friday the 13th, Jason Takes Manhattan, because I had seen like part five or something tangentially, like playing in another room, and was like, oh, that's too scary for me. But I remember being like, it's camp. Like, I don't go to camp. I live in the city. And then finally it was like, oh, fuck, Jason's coming to get me.
Yeah.
Like, and then it was right after that, was Chucky and Leatherface and Michael. So really it was franchise stuff. And the movie that kind of made me a more adventurous horror watcher, I would say I discovered around age like 13, was Reanimator. That was the movie where I said, oh, there's some weird shit out there. That's like I was doing all of the like horror prerequisites, and now I was going to dive into like advanced stuff that I wasn't quite ready for. And I really became the kind of person who then sought out the most obscure things. I mean, also this is the same time as USA Up All Night and Joe Bob's Monster
Mhm.
Vision and stuff like that. So all of those things were kind of harmoniously coming together in that way. And it was really around probably like 14, 15 when I decided like I'm not going to just remain surface level. I love discovering the weirdest thing possible on cable and not knowing what it was until the guide channel got to what that channel
Yep.
was, all of those experiences.
Well, I think that that's, Donato and I come from quintessential horror backgrounds in the sense that sorry, Donato's dad is a police officer. My dad is a deacon. Like horror was
Mm,
transgressive, and so we grew up in a household or in households where like horror was interesting and maybe sort of tacitly accepted. But it was definitely on the fringe. It's interesting to me and a welcome reminder for me to hear from folks who grew up in households that were more accepting of that. And it sounds like, because horror is always, and I don't want to talk about today's film just yet, but I think about the elements of that would have been considered exploitation or transgressive. But I think that there is also the notion that a lot of those movies have been reclaimed by the communities that they're sort of engaging with or poking fun at. And I just think about maybe how differently that could have played for me. Any of the horror film that I cut my teeth on might have played for me if I grew up in a household that kind of sat down and talked about the representation issues too, and like had me think about the movies that I was watching, other than just being like, oh, I don't know if you should be watching that. All right, we'll let it slide. I think that that's just so much more of a healthy upbringing, certainly than the one that, no knock on my parents, but certainly than the one that I had with my relationship
Yeah,
to
and
media.
same. No knock on mine. I know my mom listens to the podcast. You did a great job. Don't worry. But it is so interesting to hear like the complete opposite upbringing than I had. I was encouraged to go play sports and do the things and do all like the common kid stuff. And that's again, it was not a bad thing that was where it was. But growing up in like a Jersey suburb like, with a teacher and a detective, you know that's how it was. Media was not the same in that my journey has been said many times on this podcast, but it just, the idea that I had to kind of find my own way. And I was going to the movies at like in high school and it was just simply whatever was playing, not horror, just the mainstream stuff and how that switched. And I mean, for you,
Yeah.
like the same thing where you're talking about you had a Sopranos podcast and yet you're the guy with an entire back tattoo collage of John Carpenter.
I forgot I showed you that.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Sure. The tarp came off.
It did. It doesn't take a lot for me to pop my shirt off. No, but it's fun. The funny thing about that too is you're talking about your upbringings, and I do this. I do this podcast for the love of doing it, of watching the movies, talking about them, having the conversations, putting it out there. I hang around in a lot of the horror circles. I've dabbled a little bit in production on some short films, but nothing too crazy. So horror isn't what I do for a living. And so I find that so funny. It's like you're talking about this upbringing of like a cop and a teacher. Well, I mean, that's my job. I'm an elementary school teacher. So that's my career. And it's a career that I love. And it's a career that affords me the ability to have, downtime after 3:30 or 4 p.m. Holiday, federal bank holidays and stuff off, and then the breaks in the summer and spring break stuff like that, because it enables me to be able to do festival stuff, and it enables me to if I wanted to sit down and work on writing something, I would have that. And even I think not next year, the year after next year, I'll be eligible for my sabbatical if I decide to take one.
Mm. Well, let's bridge that gap a bit then. How does that upbringing, your career interest for a teacher, which is not something I assume you just stumbled into, that's something you have to take conscious steps, multiple steps. I have many friends that are teachers. How did podcasting come into that? How did you decide that you wanted to go from somebody who was consuming media to, for lack of a better word, producing it, telling your own stories, hosting your own space that you would be inviting people to? And you can talk about that within the lens of The Sopranos too. I think same question.
That's an excellent question. I would basically I never really thought of myself as someone with a story to tell, as silly as that sort of sounds to say out loud. Um, I never really considered it. I think podcasting becoming a medium, there were a lot of shows I started consuming when was getting into podcasts, and I was like, oh, these guys are cool. These guys are knowledgeable. These guys are fun to listen to. I like this. I like this. I didn't really think of it as something that I would do on my own, only because the idea of cultivating an audience never really occurred to me. And nothing ever like jumped out because it would have been, oh, what do I want to talk about? Halloween. Okay, everyone's talking about Halloween on a podcast. So I didn't have that kind of streamlined thing. One of the guys from the Sopranos podcast messaged me, and I had never podcasted before. I had done like one thing where somebody in a Facebook group for another podcast was interviewing them and did it in podcast form. And that was my only real exposure to it. And so I was like, we went on a call and to see if we would be like a good fit. But I was really green. I hadn't really picked up on the mechanics of it yet. And I was very unnatural, I think, on mic at that point. Probably being someone who public speaks helps because, I also used to, before I was teaching, I was bartending and waiting tables and stuff. And at the same time, I was hosting trivia night in a bar. So I was reading questions and cracking jokes and stuff like that. And so the talking into a microphone never alienated me. I never really had a problem with public speaking, but I think getting the rhythm of podcasting was something that had to come to me. And once I was doing that for a little while, I started to feel more comfortable, but I didn't really view myself as a podcaster. It wasn't really until Steve and I did this show where we're like, okay, no, like this is the Sopranos one always felt like if we want to stop doing this at some point on a whim, we'll just stop. Like it didn't feel like we were really like committed so much to the idea. We were just doing it because we enjoyed having the conversations. Whereas like Steve and I approached this show like we need to make sure that we release on time every week, and we need to make sure we have some episodes in the can so that we don't fall behind, and we need to let's be conscious about the kind of guests that we're bringing on, and let's think about how we're going to meet these movies where they are and how we're going to approach talking about them. And that all sort of is very recent. Like that's all stuff that's been conscious to me only really within the last 2.5 years. That's been the time that we've been doing the show.
And what would be you talk about you could walk away from The Sopranos at any point, didn't feel like it was something that you needed to see through to completion. I mean, there is a finite number of Charles Band movies. I will point it doesn't seem like it. It does seem like that goes on forever.
But still quite I
But
was
I'm
gonna say, still quite a lot.
still quite a few. Like I don't want to, you got plenty of fodder for upcoming
Three have
episodes.
been greenlit and made in the time that we've been recording.
Well, all right. So odds are at some point you will run out of new movies. Does that fill you with excitement? Does that fill you with dread? Like what when you are tying yourself to something that has a concrete conclusion, how do you feel about knowing that someday there you will just run out of things and you will wrap the podcast?
I think it depends on what the audience is looking for, like how much the audience want for our content is there. If the interest in the show kind of dies off naturally too, then it seems like a foregone conclusion. It's like, well, we did it. We're completists. We did them all. It was a fun ride, and we move on to our next project. If the show continues to grow and sort of the umbrella of what we're covering continues to expand, then it may not be limited just to Charles Band. Like it could turn into something else. I always wanted to do a thing called like a half moon where we did like a bonus episode that was about something that's kind of full moony in spirit, but not actually a Charles Band production. So it'd give us an opportunity to talk about something else. But right now we're in the zone where there's like so many of them that
Mhm.
we're only focused on what's there. And so I think it's our 138th episode that we'll be releasing the same day as this podcast. We have, I think, up to episode 144 or 143 or 144 recorded. So we're kind of getting close to the 150 episode
Mhm.
mark. And, 150 is a nice round number. But it's still only really a third probably of the stuff that's credited to Charles Band when you factor in, these like adult movies and stuff that he's uncredited as an executive producer on. Like we're going to cover those too because we feel like they fit. So to think the show's been going about 2.5 years, if it goes another five to finish everything, I would be pretty proud of that. And I would say I don't
Yeah.
necessarily feel like you need to go any further longer than that.
I mean,
No, and I'm not advocating for you to wrap up, but I know that sometimes when Donato and I talk about Certified Forgotten, it feels endless. So it's like, well, it must be interesting to sort of have like a destination in mind.
I feel like Corman and Trauma are right there. If you ever wanted to start a
True.
new a new kind of adjacent podcast.
Well, we've sort of one of the things we've been doing is bringing guests in who, because there's a lot of crossover, like the Venn diagram of like AIP Corman stuff and trauma, and or New World Corman trauma and Full Moon stuff has a pretty meaty center. So we've been bringing people in who are involved in some Full Moon stuff, and some of them are people who have maybe done some Full Moon projects but have worked more with trauma. For example, like a month or two ago, we released an episode which was an interview with Debbie Rashawn. And Debbie Rashawn is mostly associated with trauma. What was great about that interview was we got to find out information about her work on the full moon stuff that we covered, but we talked with her a lot about trauma. And so it worked as a way for us to kind of break format and talk about something that isn't just like what we're covering on the show, because Steve and I are also like pretty knowledgeable about trauma stuff too. So it was fun to have that conversation and be able to talk about Sergeant Kabuki Man and not worry about, well, how am I going to make this tie to the show? The connection to the show was obvious because it was Debbie Rashawn. And with same thing with Tiffany Shepis. We had Tiffany Shepis on a couple of months ago. Again, also heavily, trauma. And then there's some other people who've been on and they have like mainstream careers too. Kevin Spiritus, who from Subspecies 2 and Subspecies 5, he and 3, he was on as part of an interview that we did with some Subspecies cast members. And it was one of the times where we got to actually talk about Friday the 13th because he's in Friday the 13th, part 7. So it was like we got to talk about that on our show. It had, tangentially. And so that's always been, I think, by design so that we can, branch out a little bit.
Well, talking about staying true to your mission
Hmm.
as a podcast, we have a mission. We talk about films with 10 or fewer reviews. And so when we come back, we're going to talk about Out of the Dark, which is this week's episode. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back. This week on the podcast, we're going to talk about Out of the Dark. And if you haven't seen it, it's on Tubi, so super accessible, decent commercial breaks. Tubi did a good job of kind of matching up to those moments. Underrated element, maybe we'll talk about that. But if you haven't seen it, here's a quick synopsis to get you kind of in the mood for today's conversation. Who you gonna call? Sweet Nothings. That's right. Everyone loves California's hottest phone sex hotline. Even the young mix of aspiring actors and models who make money on the side by talking dirty to strangers for $5 a minute. But when someone starts turning their wildest fantasies into a deadly reality, I'm good at this. The girls find themselves the target of a serial killer who stalks the streets of Los Angeles dressed as a clown. If anyone at Sweet Nothings is going to survive, they'll need to rely on photographer Kevin and actress Christy to solve the murders and take on the killer before it's too late. Shaped like a Brian De Palma film and featuring the final on screen performance of Divine, Out of the Dark is an exemplary piece of 80s trash. And I say that with a great deal of affection, having now seen it for the first time. Jarrod, you were
Yes.
invited on the podcast. You picked Out of the Dark. What made this the movie you want to talk about today?
Well, I mean, I think it checks all the boxes of something that's certified forgotten. I mean, this is a film that, was made at the time where slasher movies were starting to go out of fashion. So we're talking about, 19, it was made in 1988. Release dates vary. I think it had like one theatrical premiere in 88 and then in 89 maybe opened, not wide, but in a few more theaters. And so if you, depending on where you look, you'll get either 1988 or 89 as the copyright for this movie. But it was made at a time where horror was starting to change a lot. There was a lot more emphasis on the supernatural at that time. And even like the big franchises were kind of, for lack of a better phrase, jumping the shark a little bit. And so this is a movie that came out to very little fanfare and was forgotten for a very long time. I did not see this movie in the 80s. So sometimes, I have a relationship with movies that goes back 30, 35 years. This is not one of them. I saw this movie for the first time, I'm going to say around 2022 or so, when I was doing one of my first like really deep Tubi deep dives where I was just
Mhm.
kind of like scouring Tubi and seeing like what's there. And I don't remember what the movie was that I had watched, but this came up as a suggestion. And so I was like, okay, Out of the Dark 1988. I don't know that title. So I looked at the description and I read the plot synopsis on Tubi and I went, well, that sounds right up my alley because I love De Palma movies. I love LA thrillers. I love erotic thrillers, things like that, movies like that. And so I was like, I'm surprised I haven't seen this. Then I read the cast list and I went, I'm really surprised I haven't seen this movie. And I watched it, and one of the first things I was struck by was I was thinking before it started playing, okay, if this was a movie that came out at that time and these people are in it, nobody knows anything about it, I've never heard about it, maybe it's a movie that people are trying to forget. Like maybe it's ultra cheap, maybe it's shot on video. Maybe I didn't really know what to expect, and it started, and from the very first scene, I was completely enraptured. I was like, this movie is so artfully shot that I was like, wow. I was completely wowed by it. And I was engaged from the first minute of the movie. And I was like, this is actually terrific. And this is a movie that nobody knows about. And so I then did that thing you do where you start introducing it to friends, and so I
Mhm.
started showing, I started telling some friends about, oh, go on Tubi, watch this movie. And a couple of my friends did, and they were like, oh, wow, that was actually like a surprisingly good movie. And I was like, yeah, isn't it weird that none of us have ever heard of this movie before? And I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. I've come to now have a personal connection to the movie, which I'll talk a little bit about a little bit later on. But in the beginning, it was just, oh, you're looking for something you've never heard of? Seek this movie out. And we all have those movies. And this one kind of became that for me for a little while.
Yeah, it is. It's. I can understand why folks might be hesitant to watch it. It's certainly not one you'd watch with your parents, right? It is a slasher. It's an erotic thriller. It kind of exists at the boundaries of the home video scene in like the 80s and early 90s, where a movie could be kind of a couple of different things. And I think this one walks a couple of lines and walks it really, really well.
Mhm.
But before we get into kind of that conversation, Donato, I have to assume this was a first time watch for you. I can't imagine that, that you were, watching this, on a sunny Saturday afternoon in Los Angeles at one point.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm again on my own journey trying to watch as much horror as possible, but not having that guide to say. So this is not on my radar at all. This slipped through the cracks. And I also want to highlight why something like Tubi or a video store, like in whatever era we're talking about, is so important because what you both are saying about, Jared, you just said you're like, yeah, I was on Tubi and I discovered this movie, or Monagle saying like how easy it was to watch on Tubi. The actual programming they are doing is so fucking much better than anyone else, like, will give us credit for. Like the fact that this is just sitting there to be discovered, where Netflix isn't doing that, Hulu's not doing that. God bless Shutter and what they do, but they can only do so much. So the idea that you can watch Out of the Dark on Tubi is, it's a little bit of a miracle. And yes, first time watch, this is my shit. This is my shit. It's a weird ass fucking pseudo slasher. It is doing so much with the eroticness of it. Like there's a sex scene in here that is so laughably, I've never, like, it's not portrayed sexily, let's say, and it's not shot with this allure. It is just rough sex, and you're like, oh, okay, we're just going right for the soft core. Great, that's fine. It is, like you said, Monagle, like living at boundaries. I feel like this pushes boundaries, and that's why
Yeah.
it doesn't get talked about in that way. Living at the boundary would be just enough to get you into a theater and get you mass appeal and do all that stuff. Where I feel like Out of the Dark is going bananas with either fucking Bonzo or the eroticness. Like the concept is just silly enough where it is so endearing, but a bit too much for any kind of mainstream notoriety. So like, does it make sense that it was kind of forgotten and not really picked up immediately? Sure, but like to me, it's like a Demon Wind in that sense. Where I get it, I love Demon Wind more than everybody, but it is existing right at the edge of, again, Demon Wind on the edge of being an Evil Dead, on the edge of being something like that,
Mhm.
but it's just too far into its own absurdity. Out of the Dark is a step better than that, let's say quality wise, but it still lives in that area where it's just going to be too much for some people upon reading the synopsis to really dive into.
Too derivative to be original, too original to be derivative. Yes.
Yeah, I think that works. I think if you have a one lane, a lot of times is where you can kind of compile mainstream audiences. You know, maybe or maybe you bend the genre slightly. This is wearing like five hats. Like this is a
Mm,
slasher, has elements of a slasher, elements of a giallo, elements of just straight black comedy, which I think there's a lot of intentional comedy in this movie that works. Also, it also is a whodunit. It's also a Skinamax movie. Like it's all of these things at once, and I do think that that's maybe what turns some people off. Not me. Like to me, it was this like amazing stew of all of these things. But some people, I feel like might look at it and just not really quite know what to make of it when it's juggling. I hate all of these metaphors I'm using: hats, stew,
yeah.
juggling. It's doing all of these things, and I think it does a lot of them really well. And I'm amazed that my thing about this movie though is it was a lot of people coming together, and one person who I don't know if he thought this was going to be a hit, but had pumped a lot of money into it and had a lot of faith in it is Paul Bartel. And Paul Bartel from, you know, like Eating Raoul and all of those movies, Rock and Roll High School. He executive produced this and he gave a lot of money to Michael Schroeder, who's the filmmaker here, to get this movie made. And I think he had a lot of faith in it. And Zane Levitt and Greg DeFelice wrote this movie, and I think they thought maybe with the backing of Paul Bartel, because here's how this kind of came about. I think you can look at a movie like this and wonder how did they get these people first of all for the movie, and that's really Paul Bartel because he came in as executive producer and he had worked on a movie a couple of years earlier called Lust in the Dust, and in that movie, there's Tab Hunter, who has a cameo in Out of the Dark, Karen Black, a bunch of other people. And so I think it was sort of as a favor, probably to Paul Bartel more than anything, for them to be involved in this movie, which is pretty incredible because it is a murderer's row of B movie actors here. I mean, you have Karen Black, who's incredible. You have Bud Cort from Harold and Maude, you know, as Dave Stringer, the weird red herring, creepy red herring guy. You have Lainey Kazan and Tab Hunter in really weird cameos. Tab Hunter hitting Bud Cort with his car and then asking how much his watch must have cost. And then you have um, Jeffrey Lewis, Juliette Lewis's father, great B movie actor who plays the drunk photographer Dennis. And then there's I'm still naming people. Obviously, Divine in their last performance, Out of Drag, and all of these people, and Paul Bartel himself as the motel owner with the toupee. So funny, such a great little scene. And then I think one of the strengths of this movie too is a really endearing cast of unknowns too, who went on to work in a lot of B movie stuff. Like to connect it to my show, one of my favorite people in this film is an actor named Star Andreef, and she plays Camille, the new girl at the agency, who I think is killed. Spoiler alert. I mean, maybe we should put spoilers before if people want to watch the movie, in a really effective, kind of sad scene in the movie. And I think she's really good. And she went on to be in a number of B movies, a couple Full Moon movies we covered on the podcast. Also, a really interesting Cat Shea vampire movie called Dance of the Damned, and a bunch of other B movie stuff. I think she's really good. Karen Mayo Chandler, who plays Barbara, the one who gets knocked off her scooter and then killed. She was in the who is the Jim Wynorski? I was trying to think who did Chopping Mall. Jim Wynorski movie that he made, which is Sorority House Massacre 3, but it was released as Hard to Die. And it's essentially a Die Hard parody, except the people in the building who have to fight the intrusion are just a bunch of bikini clad ladies.
The silliest ever instance of a sequel being turned into it. Yeah, like I love that story of just, hey, let's make a sequel, but it's not a sequel. Like it's
Yeah.
just fucking yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and you mentioned earlier, Jared, that the how good this movie looks, and I think that that's, I think that we're sort of, I feel like I in the era of, bad lighting and a lot of CGI, digital backdrops, it's easy to point to movies even from 20 years ago and be like, look how good. You hear that idea kicked around on social media a lot. Like the worst movie from 1995 looks better than half the movies that are made in 2025, right? That kind of a mentality.
Mhm.
But I think even above and beyond, there is an emphasis on production design in this that goes kind of far above what a lot of these movies, what we think of when we think of one of these kinds of films. So can you talk a little bit about for the folks that really want to see a movie that looks good, what it is about the production design and the locations in this film that make it so enticing?
Excellent question. And before I answer that question, I just want to say, out of all the list of all the people, I left out Tracy Walter, aka Bob the Goon from Tim Burton's Batman, playing just the assholiest detective that you will ever see, like the world's most put upon detective. I mean, he has some correct instincts, but no, this movie is shot by a guy named Julio Macat, and Julio Macat shot a lot of movies you've seen, like Home Alone and Wedding Crashers. It worked in a lot of Pitch Perfect. He worked in a lot of mainstream movies. Um, I think the crew that worked on this movie was a very professional crew, and I think there's something in the stylized borrowing. I think it's borrowing a lot from Italian films. It's also borrowing a lot from De Palma. There's a lot of the color palette of, let's say, like Body Double in this movie, which is a De Palma movie that I really love. Um, and I think it's borrowing from, it's not necessarily the black glove killer. Actually, it would be like a white glove killer, I think, in this movie of a giallo. But I think a lot of the reds and blues really come through, and it's the '80s, and I think it leans into that neon aesthetic, like Ken Russell, Crimes of Passion, stuff like that. And I think there was definitely an emphasis on that, and it makes it a really interesting timepiece. Another thing I like about this movie is that there are scenes in the movie that take place in the rain, and there's a lot of like a slick kind of sheen over the film itself, which I think
Mhm.
is a really interesting artistic touch. I just think it was a movie that was made with a lot of care, whereas you can look at things that are cashing in on any trends, and Lord knows I cover a lot of them on the show. Things that are made quickly and cheaply, and the concern of the people isn't necessarily make a good movie. It's let's get this out on shelves quickly. And while there probably was some of that, like let's cash in on this kind of erotic thriller home video market, I think Mark Manos, who edited this movie, and Michael Schroeder, who directed it, and the whole cast, and Julio Macat, who shot it, and all of these people working together, I think we're just trying to make a good movie. And I think that that comes across. I think it's really artistically
Yeah.
considered. This doesn't feel exploitative in that way. It doesn't feel like a cash grab. It doesn't feel cynical. I think, it gets lumped in with a horde of other movies that were being dumped onto cable or into video stores at the time. But something jumped out my first watch with this one that made me think like there's something more here than there is to those films, and that's why since I saw it for the first time, I always champion it and hold it close to my heart and try to get other people to watch it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
to me, there's almost like a little maniac feel to it, and just the way that it is playing with the slasher, but it is not the grimy New York City. Obviously, that is the city itself is a character, and the city itself has so much personality, and I think that also comes through and out of the dark in the opposite way. It is going for the more Hollywoodized photo shooting, all that stuff, and I really am. I love the cinematography during like the actual photo scenes and the way like they're pumping in the smoke and they use shadows and they use like staging and blocking. There's a lot of care put into the stylistic nature of being a photographer and making sure that it actually looks good, because like I don't know, I watched some of these movies about fashion in LA and photography, and for a horror movie specifically, they don't always put the care into the fashionista style of it, like the actual like visual appeal that would go along with that industry. Where I think very much here the sexuality is forefront. Like obviously this is about sex workers and phone workers, so you have a lot of that there. But like the actual imagery too goes along with it. It's not just playing in that world and faking it. It is very much putting us in that world and making it feel authentic and sleazy and charming and all this stuff. Like, you get the highs and the lows of it in every swing. And I guess every swing is true because it's a fucking clown with a baseball bat at the same time. And like that, just the way it bounces between comedy and horror too is so interesting. You know, the one man that gets killed outside and his wife is like recounting the scene and she just like couldn't be bothered. Yeah, he's a schmuck, whatever, he's dead. It's very sitcom-y at times and quite charming
It's
about that.
broad. The
Right.
comedy is
Hmm.
sometimes broad. Uh, if I may, this movie, I said I spent a few years championing this and introducing it to people. So I collaborate sometimes with a collective here called the Brooklyn Horror Society. And the Brooklyn Horror Society put on free events all the time. And they will do, usually it's every Wednesday of the month. It's at a very cool metal bar, dive bar called Lucky 13. And what they do is they will show movies, or they'll do trivia night, or they'll do a bingo, or just a social gathering or something. But usually they have four or five times a month these events that they're doing. So I was talking to one of the people about the programming for, this was months back, for the month of August. And I said it would be they had, someone had expressed interest in maybe showing Maniac. And I was like, you should do something called like the Summer of Sleaze, and you should just pick like really grimy movies and show them for the whole month. And it was like, well, what would you do? And it was like, well, Maniac, obviously. And you can do, someone else offered to introduce Frankenhooker, which is a great choice. And I brought Out of the Dark to them, and I said, I think this one would be a good fit. And I said, what I think would be fun about it is that no one will have seen it. Like, there'll be maybe two other people in the room besides me who've seen the movie. I said, don't watch the movie beforehand. Like, trust me that this was one that you are going to want to show, and that people aren't going to be coming up to you after and saying, why did you choose that, or why did you force us to watch that? Um, and so I said, just trust me on this movie. And so we advertised it, Summer of Sleaze things for one of them. And so I was going to do an introduction to it and basically do 2 to 3 minutes about, I'm introducing this movie. This was my pick. Brooklyn Horror Society are great, gracious enough to show it. Here's why I love this movie. I hope you love it too. Blah 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 type thing. Weirdly, like a week before that, I get a message from Greg DeFelice, who is the screenwriter of this movie, and he goes, "Hey, I heard like you're showing my movie at Brooklyn Horror Society," and I'm like, "Yeah." And he's like, "That's so cool. I didn't really know anybody knew about this movie." And so what it turns out, what happened is his daughter lives in New York and follows Brooklyn Horror Society. So one day she saw us promo posting and said to her father, like, "They're showing this movie, at this place." And it turned into this amazing thing where he and I were going back and forth, and I was telling him how much I enjoy the movie and I love showing it to people. And then it turned into, he was like, "Well, actually, I'm in town, so I think I'm going to come." And I was like, "Cool." And so he ended up coming with his daughter and family, and it was a packed house. And when I say packed house, I mean packing this back room of a bar, not like a 200-seat theater. It was probably 50 people there, but a good crowd of people to watch this movie. And it turned into, I was like, "Do you want to do a Q and A?" And he was like, "Sure." And so we did a makeshift like 10-minute Q&A afterward that I curated with him. Uh, and the crowd loved it. The movie played great. They were so excited that he was there. He was excited because he was saying the last time he had seen it in a theater was in Times Square in 1989. And now it was, 2024, 35 years later, or no, it was this year. So 2025, 36 years later, he's seeing it for the first time again with a crowd. And it was a great night. And it just was a testament, I think, to the fact that there's a lot here, and this is an audience movie. People were laughing at the right times. They were hooting and hollering at the kind of ridiculous stuff or the dated stuff, but not in a disrespectful way. And it was just like a really joyous night. And I could tell that Greg was super appreciative that this movie is finding a new audience. And everyone walked away being like, that's a really fun movie that I had no idea existed, which is the experience of 99% of people.
I love that. And I think that that's That's something that we've had a couple of brushes with on Certified Forgotten too, because of the nature of the films that we talk about. We have twice on this podcast featured Entrance, which is a really incredible like 2011 psychological thriller. Like if we ever get a chance to basically tie one movie to Certified Forgotten and it's synonymous, I think at this point it have to be Entrance. But David Dismalchin joined us for an episode. He championed
Amazing.
it, and it got back to Susie Block, who's the lead actress, and she sent us an Instagram message and was like, "It's so incredible you guys are talking about this movie. Thank you so much." And I bring that up not to brag, maybe a little bit. We're all bragging a little bit here,
Sure.
but just about these movies. You think of film as everlasting, it's more ephemeral than that, right? Like, yes, you can have the movie, you can go see it, you can pick up a DVD or watch it on Tubi, but the idea that there's an audience for a lot of the things that you talk about and that we talk about, that's a more fleeting thing for a lot of filmmakers. And I think it's, the few times that we've had an opportunity in this podcast that we've heard from people about movies that we've put on this podcast, some films, getting on a podcast with a couple hundred listeners, an episode with a couple hundred downloads, that is the most validation they're going to have for that particular film in a really, really long time. That's not how it should be, but it's just, a lot. The Sauron's eye of film criticism tends to pass movies like this over, at like Out of the Dark over. And so I'm glad you shared that story, because I'm really happy for him. It's awesome to be able to say, oh, people still give a shit about this thing that I did 30 years ago. But I think it's also a reminder that you never know, if you're just going through your day posting about stuff online, making podcasts, writing essays, you never know when somebody involved in that project is going to be like, fucking thanks, man. Like, I really needed to hear that. Thank you so much for this thing that I spent months or years of my life on, that it still has enduring value, and there's still people that care about it.
Well, I think we know that more than anybody because we're all doing creative passions. And listen,
Yeah.
when we get even that little bit, like one person, just one person saying that, I think gives me enough life to be like, oh, I can do this for a few more weeks. Like, all
Yep.
right, I got enough energy. Yeah, it's to see that come back around, but again, to see it come back around for movies as well, and for a movie that was 88 and very of the time and very of that era of filmmaking, to still be able to sustain an audience and have that kind of engagement. And I think it's just a reminder too that like we're still craving all different types of horror, and this does not look like a lot of the horror we are seeing right now. Like Out of the Dark is everything we've said it is. It is over the top erotic thriller. It's an over the top slasher in the way that it's playing with broad comedy, and it's not exactly scary when the clown is killing people because he's saying one liners and doing his whole bonzo voice. And we'll
Mhm.
we'll save and other secrets for those of you that want to go watch this movie. But it's doing a lot that should be laughed at, and yet is an enjoyable experience front to back, not to be laughed at. It's to be laughed with and to be enjoyed with, and all of those
Yeah.
things. Fucking Bartel's Wig Alone. Like, of course, laugh at that. It is silly. It is silly as hell, and like stepping in blood with his Converse. It's all just so strange. But I
It
think
w-
that's what makes it nice.
Yeah, strange is a good word, and which is not a derogatory. That's not how I'm using it here. But like, it is a strange movie to the point where I think the day of that screening, I was a little bit nervous that the movie wasn't going to play well. Like I was a little bit nervous that I'm like, I'm putting a lot of stock in this. They're trusting me on this blind pick that they've never seen. What if it just kind of falls dead with a thud? Like, what if people aren't responding to things? What if people aren't into it? What if, they're not on board with sort of the dated aspects of it? Because one thing that I do, and I will say the thing that got me over the hump was that in the very first scene of the movie, well, plus people's energy was high because we introduced Greg DeFelice, a screenwriter there. So I think people were kind of primed to be like, okay, like we're gonna have fun. We're gonna try at least having fun with this, if not for any other reason, but then to be polite. um, but in the first scene, it's Joanne who is the one who ends up getting killed at the park, but it's her on the call with Kevin, and obviously they're not showing his face, they're showing just like his body, but there's a lot of really great close-up shots, and Mark Manos did a fabulous job editing this movie. It's a really well edited movie, and like there's all these close-up kind of like shots of eyes close up and like nipples and things like that, and it's like it's a little bit sexy and erotic, and then it cuts to this where you see that it's her reading off of the bullet points of the script, and the whole audience burst into laughter, and I was like, okay, now I know this is going to play. Like, they're going to get the comedy, they're going to understand it. And I thought that's just such a funny moment. I feel like that might have been the moment that endeared me to it even right away. Like, I was like, that's funny. Like, you wouldn't really
Hmm.
normally see that. And one of the things also that could have worried me when you're dealing with movies that are products of their time, especially, characters who are sex workers, who are female, who are written by men, is you could see sort of the misogyny come out. You see it a little bit in a character who's sort of outwardly misogynist, but I think that they did a really great job of writing the girls in this movie to where they feel, it's a B movie. So you're going to get character types. You're not going to get like super duper fleshed out people. It's just not the time to really go back and enhance a script in that way. You're going to have character types, but for having character types, even I think Karen Black is so endearing as like the den mother to all of them. But I think what I love so much about it is their camaraderie feels really natural. It's not, I think in a lesser movie, is they would introduce you to the workplace dynamics of Sweet Nothings. And then what would happen is it would be like, oh, this one is bitchy to this one because she's jealous, and this one is can't stand this one, and there'd be this like catty infighting, and that doesn't happen here. Like, they're all very concerned about each other. They all feel like friends and colleagues, and I think that that's really. I don't want to maybe it's hyperbolic to use the word noble, but I think at the time it could have very easily been a bunch of catty women in an office setting. Here's like the one who has an eating disorder, here's the one who's a bitch, and there is a moment where Barbara is kind of trying to seduce Kevin when she's getting her headshots done, but that's about the extent of what you see in terms of anyone kind of acting disrespectfully toward each other. I think it's very, they all feel different and somewhat realized, which I think is a feat for a B movie like this. And I think they're all written as to feel like actual women who could do this job. They toe that line between the mundane nature of their everyday life and then having to like then go back on the phone again and then have a side conversation and then go back
Yeah.
on the phone again. I thought all of that is handled really as carefully and as gracefully as it could for something that was written in the late 80s.
Yeah, I'm going to describe this to everyone forevermore as if Dario Argento had directed Support the Girls. That is my sales pitch. And if that makes sense to you, then I think you might understand the wavelength that it's on.
I love that.
Yeah, it's good.
So that brings us to the last question that we ask our
Hmm.
guests. Donato's still making a face. I don't think he liked that
No, I said
comparison
that's
at
good.
all.
I said
Okay.
literally like that's a great fucking way
Okay.
to
There
put
we
that
go. All
together.
right. I was like, ooh, all right. Missed the boat on that. Last question for you, then, Jarrod. We always end our episodes talking about how this film, the films that our guests bring, earn a little bit more cachet, earn an audience with a bit of time. I think this is probably one of the rare instances where we can say that the person who might have done the most in the world to increase the reach of this movie might be you. So I think you have a unique perspective to offer for Out of the Dark. But where what do we do, or how does this film continue to find its audience, and where do you think this ends up maybe in another 5, 10 years?
That's a really good question. And I think, this is called Certified Forgotten in that it has not a lot of professional reviews on Rotten Tomatoes, but I will say it is certified fresh for the 5 reviews that it does have. So there is that. Um, I think about this sometimes. I know that a very beautiful 35 millimeter print of this movie exists because about a year and a half ago, maybe, the Deuce program, who they do like the sleazy programming for Nighthawk, they had it. They had a 35 millimeter print, and they did a sold out Nighthawk screening of it, which was incredible. So much fun. They do their whole intro beforehand and stuff. I forget where exactly they got it. It was on loan from like the University of Maryland or something like that. But somewhere preserved is a really gorgeous 35 millimeter print of this movie. What I would like to see happen is I would like to see this get some kind of boutique treatment. whether it's Vinegar Syndrome, whether it's Severin, whether it's Arrow or someone like that. I think it's maybe a rights issue in that I think the movie is still, I think, owned by a big company, by like Sony or someone like that. So I don't know necessarily what goes into that, but I would love to see, you know, a Blu-ray at least, if not a 4K restoration. I would love. Now, you said that I'm probably the person bringing this to most people's attention. I don't know how to go about doing this, but I would love to kind of champion, being in charge of getting some people to produce bonus features for some kind of release of this
Mm.
movie. Get some of these cast members who are mostly still alive together to do something. Get, the screenwriters who are not only alive but are gettable and still in contact with each other. Uh, to do some bonus features for something like this, and to see it in, a nice Blu-ray or something. It was released in the most bare bones DVD you can imagine, like a DVD that didn't even have chapters. Like, it was a slipcase with no insert. That was, you put the movie on, the movie starts playing, it's the only thing on the disc, and it was never released in a better format. And I don't know all the reasons for why that is. I mean, it's maybe, like we said, a certified forgotten. There's kind of a lack of interest in the movie in that sense, or it's someone inquired about it. I will also say that I think I am responsible, though, for the brief period that this movie was on Shutter, because I saw Sam at the Texas Chainsaw 50th, and we went out to get a bite to eat with some people afterwards. And we were talking about movies, and I brought this movie up, as I'm wont to do when people don't ask. And he was like, I don't think I know that movie. Looked it up on his phone, looked at the cast, looked at the thing, was like, holy shit, I don't know this movie. Lo and behold, about 3 months later, it showed up on Shutter. And it was there for about, I'm going to say, maybe like 4 to 6 months. And then I know maybe it was just, I don't know how they tally, what is, how they kind of engagement track, things that are
Yeah.
people are watching. But maybe it just wasn't popular enough that they took it back off, or maybe the rights changed hands. I don't know. But I will say that I think I was somewhat responsible for that.
Yes,
Sam
it's
Zimmerman, if you are listening, please call in and confirm. The number is 1-800. We don't have a phone number. Donato, go.
Just give him the number for Sweet Nothings. Make him pay $5 a minute.
There we go. There we go.
yeah. I mean, that's the answer. The fact that this doesn't have one of those fade to black kind of Arrow Video or TerraVision, any one of them boutique labels, like this is primed for the new release. It's primed for the 10 deep dive video essays of people being like, what the fuck, this is finally out, let's really like dissect every part of it. So I think that'll give it a huge bump. And I'm gonna go back to Tubi. I'm gonna use Tubi and just say the fact that it, Jarrod, again, the fact that it came up to you as just oh, this is something you should watch because we know what you like, and it has become a part of your identity in a small way. Like that's important. That's good curation. That is good accessibility. And I mean, again, for something like Tubi, that's still good archiving. So I can't not call that out. Is it, would it do better if it was on Shutter longer? Sure. So I know subscription rates are crazy. Like sometimes you can only get a thing for a few months and it just
Yeah.
gets tossed around, whatever. But for something like this, I did rent it on Amazon, so like I watched it commercial free, and I watched it the $4.99 or $3.99. Like it's not that much, so it's a good way to do it. And it does need that boutique bump. I think that'll be the next step. Just
Yeah.
the Vinegar, the Arrow, whatever it is, whichever one gets it, I feel like that'll give it a new life in a really exciting way.
Agreed. And that is our episode on Out of the Dark. Jarrod, thank you so much for joining us. It was a real pleasure to talk about this film and all the works of Charles Band with you as well. And I know that you guys, like you said, you've got a couple of milestone episodes that are upcoming. So, where do folks follow your podcast or connect with you online?
Sure. If you want to check out the show, the best way to find us is you could just do Puppet Masters / Castle Freaks. When we say the name of the podcast, we kind of transpose an and in there, but in print, there's no and. You'll find the show, and there, like I said, there's a pretty extensive back catalog of episodes that are there right now, and some really good ones on the way. Um, we have Instagram also, Puppet Masters _Castle Freaks. My personal Instagram is _Giallo _Jarrod. My co-host is not using his personal right now. But we post also on like threads sometimes in Blue Sky and stuff. But I'm kind of getting tired of just promoting the show, just the two of us without any like real backing. It gets to be, as I'm sure you guys are very well aware, like a thankless effort after a while. So we're kind
Hmm.
of keeping it streamlined just to Instagram really for updates. I do want to plug the episode that was releasing the same time that you may be hearing this if you're listening to this on the day of release. It is Halloween, and it is a favorite movie of ours in the Full Moon catalog. We waited until we thought the time was right, and when we saw we had a Friday that was Halloween. It is 1996's Head of the Family, which is an incredibly batshit crazy movie. If you've never seen it and you're interested at all, I would recommend maybe watching it first and then listening to our episode on Head of the Family, which came out today or on Friday, October 31st. We've had a lot of really amazing episodes in the back. Our 100th episode, which was about like 7 months ago or so, was Michael Gingold and Barbara Crampton talking about the 40th anniversary of Reanimator. Like I mentioned, some of the other people we've had interviews with. One of my favorites that we did was with Scream Queen extraordinaire Brink Stevens. She was an incredible guest because it gave talking about the sorority babes in the Slimeball Bowl-orama 2, but also throwing some talking about the original in there too, which is a favorite of mine. And yeah, I think if you enjoy movies that are kind of certified forgotten, to borrow a phrase, or overlooked, or maybe don't get the same kind of treatment that mainstream movies do in podcasting, then definitely check out our show because I think you'll appreciate it.
Donato, I know you're still in the middle of your Halloween season. Where do folks go to find your reviews and or coverage or all that good stuff?
Yes, all the good stuff. It's at Donatobomb, DONATOBOMB. And that's going to be Blue Sky, Letterboxd, and Instagram first and foremost. I keep saying TikTok to get myself to use it more, so that'll keep happening at a slow pace. But yeah, all the reviews are still coming, and we've still got plenty of horror left this year too. So, Daily Dead is gracious enough to let me be a primary reviewer over there. So as the year keeps going, I'll keep churning them out, and then guess what? Then it's 2026, so we get to start all over again. Yay!
I love it. As for myself, just Blue Sky, Monocle at bluesky.social. You can follow this podcast on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, on YouTube Music, or anywhere else you get your podcasts from. And you can visit our website at www.certifiedforgotten.com. Today is Halloween, October 31st, and it is the last day to take advantage of our Halloween deal, which means you get the first month of Certified Forgotten for just $1. It's a pretty good deal. It supports independent film criticism and horror journalists who want to write about movies that may not be able to get picked up at other publications. I promise you, Donato and I in 5 years have not seen a fucking dollar from our podcast, or from the website. So if you're worried about your money only going to our writers, I can promise you. I wish I couldn't promise you, but I can. All of the money goes to the contributors. You ain't got nothing to worry about. Jarrod, thank you so much for joining us on this week's episode, and thank you for spreading the gospel of Out of the Dark. I think I think I know some people I might want to go turn around and recommend this movie to as well.
This was a pleasure, and it means a lot to me to get to talk about this movie in particular on a podcast and celebrate it the way that we did, for the last hour. It was really meaningful to be able to do that, and it was a great time. And I'm very gracious for you guys having me on.
Donato, why don't you take us home?
Thanks for the memory.